Hello, everyone. I just want to start by saying thanks very much to the conference organisers. I do know that this is a lot of work, and especially in the context of multilingual, multidisciplinary, hybrid, and mixed time zones. So, thank you so much. And thanks to the translators, and apologies for my monolingual Scottish status. And I hope that my accent won't be too discordant. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. And I'm hoping that we can have lots of in-person meetings in the future, and whether that's in Spain, Scotland, or elsewhere. So I do hope you and I have a good conference. So by way of introduction to me, and I do realise I'm a small face, hopefully, at the top of the screen, I am a professor in the School of Education, which I joined in 2019. And I'll say more about that return in my case, a return to Scotland, or the back and forward of our returns and departures as we occupied different kinds of classrooms as pupils, students, teachers, and educators. So I researched intersecting inequalities, often in terms of class, sexuality, and gender. And I'm concerned about what these inequalities still do, and perhaps particularly class, is often marginalised within queer theory and feminist thought, as well as in educational inequality policy, euphemistically or apolitically alluded to as a socio-economic classification or a Scottish index of multiple deprivation. So a count on a table. I've been writing about these issues for about 20 years, and I won't attempt to squeeze those 20 years into 40 minutes, but rather I'll try to highlight the old questions and concerns in supposedly new times, where ideas of LGBTQ plus inclusion has been positioned as a new difference. This supposed newness and difference is, though, contradictory. Ideas of nationhood, Britishness, Europeanness are recast as the nation state repositions as a world leading protector and guarantor of LGBT rights as part of a rainbow Europe, even post-Brexit. So queering the curriculum for me at least means being cognizant of these contradictions, of state violence rather than state solutions, as well as the messier timeframes and crossovers between now and then, or here and there. So generally, I'm suspicious of the idea of an included or completed classroom in either the compulsory or post-compulsory settings, given the continued inequality and educational disadvantage, which surpasses, I think, the LGBT acronym as an included identity position. So I started my PhD in 2001, at the time when Section 28 was being publicly debated again, and notably through the Keep the Clause campaign, which was sponsored by Scottish businessman Brian Souter. And for those who are not familiar with Section 28, it was a clause which bans schools and local authorities for talking about homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Those were the words of the time. So the Keep the Clause campaign wanted to keep Section 28 in place rather than overturn it, and to stifle talk of or even acknowledgement of LGBTQ plus existence in and beyond classrooms. So there's the Keep the Clause campaign and some headlines from that time. So arguably, and I think this is still contested though, we live in different times when the Scottish Parliament has reaffirmed its commitment to LGBT inclusive curriculum, even instigating new guidelines. And guidelines are quite different from cohesive or resource policies and practices. So I attended the parliamentary event just before lockdown in 2020 to celebrate the anniversary appeal of Section 28. Based in the Scottish Parliament, the event also served to highlight Scotland's lead, or self-proclaimed lead, on the repeal, which happened in Scotland in 2001 and the rest of the UK in 2003, mostly thanks to the efforts of Wendy Alexander at that time. So mingling around the crowd, there was a sense of connection of queers and queer encounters across time, now supposedly included in mainstreamed policy making. But these moments of connection and celebration also disguised contemporary policy, public and educational disconnections. And as one banner noted from the crowd, quote, "We stopped the clause, but the fight goes on." So the opening slides highlights UK newspaper The Guardian's cover image announcing LGBT inclusive curriculum in Scotland as World, leading this pride banner over the streets of Edinburgh. This image, as with the parliamentary party, makes me wonder about the celebration of LGBT plus rights and if we've arrived in the included classroom or included state. As posters from LGBT campaigning groups such as Stonewalls or the Tie campaign now decorate classroom corridors and schools, and schools can apply for, say, bronze, silver, gold, LGBT charter marks as affirming institutions, have we managed to queer the curriculum or queer our educational institutions? So LGBT discourse frequently glosses over, I think, queer lives in and beyond the classroom and limits the ways of imagining queer lives otherwise. Despite witnessing such glossing over, I'm not resigned to failure. I think the Scottish policy moment, and I did implicate other country context in this too, the Scottish policy moment has created a sense of optimism, and as one of my interviews, names later on, we'll see this in some of the quotes, they speak to, quote, a pulse point of optimism as a measure of the health of the LGBT-friendly state. But queer feminisms have taught me to be sceptical of the state and its institutions as generating rather than solving inequalities. I locate hope specifically in feminist classrooms and try to think through how our personal and collective investment, achievement and failure in and through education might reorientate us beyond the discrete LGBT individual as a now a recognised subject. So I started out my PhD research in the context of section 28, but debates on citizenship, inclusion and transformation now have key policy and political markers that are quite different. Nonetheless, I've written through the context of austerity, of post-Brexit Britain, pandemic times, and into the current cost of living crisis, at times shaping the conceptual and material imaginings of citizenship, or rather, as always, shaping those imaginings. Here I hope to situate the case of Scotland as a wee place, a small place, making bold claims as a world leader in and through LGBT policy development. And I use the more limited LGBT acronym throughout too, as reflective of that narrower policy framing, which often deliberately doesn't intend to include, say, the Q or the I or the plus. And so that in itself poses problems for a queer researcher, a queer audience. So here I draw on data across time and place over a 20-year period from younger and older respondents, I think across the age range of 16 to 82 years. And I'm always struck by how remarkably alike their story of education and educational dissatisfaction is, despite these supposed big shifts in policy across time. Despite that, expressed dissatisfaction means different things for different queers. It can allude to a sense of entitlement that I should have had a better education, more qualifications, increased representation, better employment post-education. The queer parents that I've interviewed, and particularly more empowered middle-class parents, repeated this entitlement in their orientation to skills. Working class queers, and here I include queers of colour and trans people, as though sometimes not having access to what is imagined as working class in the UK as white and male. But I include working class queers as often anticipating their own educational failure rather than success. LGBT inclusive curricula is a series of classroom recommendations, limits, frustrates, and disappoints, and may only resonate for an already included or entitled citizen. And so I hope to locate instead a more expansive sense of what queer feminist classrooms may be. So, on that note, I want to first say something about my own position by way of at least partially situating myself as a queer feminist researcher and thinking through the ways the past is held, repeated, and persisted in the present. So, as a school kid, placed in the bottom reading group at school, feminism has given me a politicised vocabulary through which to locate this, my experience, in relation to other structures. I'm from a working class background, and I say this in part to hold on to where I'm coming from as a starting point rather than an end or a conclusion. I say I'm working class, knowing that it still and nearly always provokes a reaction in the middle class spaces that I now claim as mine. Being an academic wasn't the future my past self imagined for me, nor was it imagined by most of my school teachers or family members. People from my estate never went to university. Yet I can say I'm a queer feminist professor. I can and still say that I'm a working class lesbian. Sometimes the saying and the storying changes depending on who's listening. Sometimes I say I'm from Glasgow, and sometimes it doesn't need to be said. Aware of the limitations and interruptions to our own stories, I circulate mine with some caution, knowing that it's already out there too, often outing me before I open my mouth, and whether I sound authentically Glaswegian or not. So I knew my family was different, and different even to other working class families within the same council estate. And being official, dangerous data, the wrong postcode, the bad area, the failing school, measured in, say, low life expectancy, teenage pregnancy rates, working class people and parents and working class mothers nonetheless refuse judgments and reinvest in working class parenting as more caring and less socially harmful. So you have Karen here talking about the educational hopes for her own child, that she just wants her to be happy and get by and do her best, fulfill her potential, whatever that may mean. You also see the frustrations of Lewis, who's talking about the expectations narrated from listening to a conversation by the bus stop of kids at a private school. So as an undergraduate, I attended university in a different social political climate and benefiting from a full maintenance grant at the time. Yet as an undergraduate at an elite Russell Group university, I felt and knew class even more than on the council estate perhaps. And so I was unsure if I was in fact escaping at all. The promise of mobility fell short then, as it does now, in an era of tuition fees, and meaning that working class students now increasingly stay with their families and attend local institutions or don't go to university. And so Dan's quote, not everybody's followed that, not everybody went to university or left their hometown or their home locality and lived this gay life, underscores this. And underscores this popular association between going to university to come out or pursuing an education to come out and be your authentic self, or to quote Judith Butler, who mockingly talks about going to Yale to be a lesbian, and my kid's gone to Edinburgh. So it's mocked because of its pretentiousness and possibility and entitlement. I do have a sense of entitlement of getting into higher education just in time. And I did imagine a different future in going to universities. And I still think that universities hold this optimistic, hopeful potential. But my sense of optimism isn't wholly tied to normative educational success or individual financial return. Queer educators have always insisted on learning as socially transformative, as a commitment to social futures, rather than a static essence or an investment in individuals. So I think the experiences of interviewees offers a refocus on the push and pull of normative success and the lack of fit now included or interpolated as educated included subjects, or say, if we extend that more broadly, privatised families, happy workers, competitive consumers. My research on working class queers, and this will be published in May by Pluto, has led me to think through how marginalised groups often pragmatically persist within these nonetheless disappointing worlds to live with a sense of failure. And often that disappointment extends to inclusive educational spaces, where class status is the primary decider of educational experience in the UK. It's only by ignoring this that the LGBT classroom can be framed as such, can be framed as inclusive. But there are exclusions within this rhetoric of inclusion. So in the last decade, maybe the last day, expanding LGBT rights have been firmly linked with Europe pursued over the long term in a raft of EU-led equalities legislation, such as the Equality Act. These shifts now imply an included or entitled LGBT citizen with legal recognition and recourse to legal justice. And in looking back over that decade-plus period, we might be tempted to celebrate the world we've won, to quote sexuality scholar Jeffrey Weeks, to mark a line between now and then, or there and here. Such borders, both material and imagined, are quickly complicated by empirical research, where participants complicate the category of citizenship and ideas of inclusion and exclusion. So claims of states and claims of citizens in being or feeling recognised by the state appear in country counts of being, say, quote, the best place for LGBT rights, or the friendliest gay city, or world leading, including LGBT inclusive education. These are all recent claims made by the UK Westminster government and the Scottish devolved government, and I've written about this in a critical social policies paper with Madison Lawrence on the LGBT action plan. So ex-Prime Minister, one of the ex-Prime Ministers, Theresa May, was well known in her wish to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, which sat rather awkwardly against her 2018 launch of the LGBT Action Plan, in which she asserted that, quote, the UK is a global leader on LGBT rights. And here we see these similar framings by ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson and First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, where they bound claims of LGBT equality to the progressive nation state, and also to this idea of being globally or world leading, or the leader. And as we likely already know, Jasper Poire defines homonationalism as, quote, an analytical category deployed to understand and historicise how and why a nation's gay-friendly status has become desirable as a mark of progress, modernity and civilisation. So focusing on Europe, we might think about Europe's self-invention or reinvention as essentially and historically LGBT plus friendly, and how that effaces political struggles and slippages around this, and ongoing violence and casting racialised others as inherent in other places, especially Muslims, migrants and refugees. as inherently unfriendly and dangerous. The idea of Rainbow Europe serves to affirm the Europeanness as residing in a liberal, responsible, reasonably included subject, persistently imagined as white and Christian. The international naming and shaming measures who are LGBT-friendly liberal democracies against LGBT-hostile terrain, and the standardizations of what LGBT inclusion looks like also excludes other queer subjects, or to quote from Theresa May, those deemed too tough, and this was a literal description, too tough for policy, political, or public inclusion. And the too tough categories that Theresa May was naming were trans, non-binary, and intersex people. So just to remind ourselves that in 1990, Cathy Cohen and Punks, Bulldaggers and Welfare Queens named those other queer subjects, those too tough people, as a way to bridge rather than reinforce the divide between queer and straight lives. But in the continued moment of othering, we witnessed a twist in homonationalism too, whereby mainstream LGBT organisations such as Out and Proud link UK withdrawal from the EU as necessary to maintain its position as a haven from homophobia. So all nations are implicated in continuous state-sanctioned violence. And I think that, as this quote makes clear, the discourse which states support do not support the rights of queers legitimates imperial preemptive strikes and the very compositions of intimacies, global order, and the understanding of life, terror, and death. So as this quote makes clear, I think the debates on LGBT inclusion seem far more than inclusion in or out of the classroom. What then are the possibilities for smaller or local queer spaces, and how do we provincialise or localise queer studies more generally when it's often located in US or UK terrain, while standing in for the global as another imperial strike, to use the language of this quote? Attention to policy promises can perhaps work to differentiate and undermine state centrism, rather than finding solutions or solace from it, redrawing the given boundary of the changing nation and revisioning our horizons. So that this quote below then looks at Brexit as a moment to think about the politics of difference and re-emerging social inequalities. So in these times, in this post-Brexit time, I'm interested in and sceptical of the myth of Scotland and Scottishness as an exceptional sign of world-leading, pro-European, different from English, LGBT, inclusive, etc., etc. Anyone, queer or otherwise, who's felt educational inequalities in and through Scottish education may be similarly sceptical. So rather than ending with my own cynicism, skepticism, I see worth in returning to classroom contexts, investing hope in the possibilities of queer feminism as a practice. So the small space that I invoke here is Scotland, as a devolved nation and constituent part of the UK. And we can think of Scotland and the Scottish classroom as a small space of inclusion or containment, but one which takes up a large world-leading space in contemporary debates. So I do so at a time when Scotland is claiming to be a different kind of nation, casting citizenship as civic rather than ethnic, and is nearer Europe, often than England specifically, in its pro-Remain vote. Scotland asserts its difference culturally, socially, educationally, and politically, and much of this is simply factual. But this difference is also manifest specifically as a difference from England and conflated into a revaluation of LGBT rights. So as an exemplar of Scottish democracy, Scottish culture. The positioning away from particularly or specifically a toxic England, to quote one interview, or England as a hellscape, to quote another, may be part of a Scottish exceptionalism, which exempts itself from the weight of the UK past, while sexual nationalisms magnifies the borders around states, citizens, and others. This returns us to questions of independence and interdependence and the very purpose of liberal nation states. Thinking back to Poir, where the comparative aspect of that can confound these categories and can lead to competitive measures of variously included or excluded citizens. So what does it mean to be queer in a wee place? What does this mean socially and educationally in and outside of our classrooms? And that I'm still asking these questions suggests that I've not found the answers in policy documents. So on the slide are a few quotes from interviewees. I'm talking specifically about Scottish difference, and this has been true of a lot of Scottish policy making and LGBT activists themselves who kind of promote this life in Scotland as an LGBT inclusive space. And so like other interviews, Lachlan expressed a change in identification around Britishness, Scottishness, and European identity. And for some, Brexit became an affirmation that Scotland should have left the UK following the 2014 referendum. And they were seeking out other allegiances like to Europe or Europeanness, even though that wasn't being offered to Scotland, like to remain. So this transitional moment between a failed state represented by the UK Westminster government and a different kind of state, which the Scottish government was seen to embody, forces a reconsideration of the purpose of the nation state and what happens when states are disassembled and reassembled. Competitive rankings and shift in identifications may perhaps disorder LGBT plus citizens in these moments and can reinstate a progressive-regressive binary. So Scottish difference wasn't always straightforwardly articulated, and others felt left down. Claims of difference were seen as suspicious, as policy gloss and rhetoric, as inaccurate. And in terms of historical timelines up until now, they were seen as fairly new and insufficient. So one interview, Simran, talks about this kind of recirculation, that all forms of discrimination evolve around legislation, that to abolish one structure is just to get another structure imposed. This again, ideas of Scottish sameness, similar structures rather than an exceptionalism or difference. And I think Alicia's quote is interesting in noting the stereotypes associated with Scotland and Scottishness, which arguably allow it to bypass some of the associations of Britain and Britishness, or perhaps Englishness specifically. So she says, it's nationality, which is a very benign series of cuddly and cosy stereotypes associated with it. And so it claiming to be world leader doesn't feel as offensive, perhaps. Okay, let's see. So Alicia's account in particular exposes the discrepancy between Scotland as a new civic nation and its enduring ethnic nationalisms, embodied and embedded in histories and presences of racism. So she talks about having a deep cynicism about Scotland because of the volume of racism and the relatively recent conservative history of the SNP, the Scottish National Party. So she talks about want to be really specific Glaswegian or general in terms of having a European identification. And she ends on saying, but I still find Scottish an unsatisfactory term, and it becomes more political. And as it becomes more political and less just a factual designation of something, the less likely I am to associate with it. So Alicia's own schooling story is one of profound racism, as someone placed in the English as a foreign language group, a bit like when I talked about being placed in the bottom reading group. Alicia was placed in that group despite being bilingual from birth. These distinctions and failures continue in the Scottish classroom where the 1+2 policy of language learning fails. So that's one native language plus 2 other languages. And I am an embodiment of such failure. But notably in recent policy, the preference is for the +2 to be modern languages, and they're favoured over dominant local minority languages. So in Glasgow, that would be Urdu, Hindi and Punjabi. So Alicia's account is multiple and intersecting, moving across time, yet bypassing the supposed arrived at LGBT state as showcase, and returning to the possibilities of queer thinking. Jasper Poir pauses on states of exhaustion, where the state has exhausted our hopes, never intended to be intersectional in its imagining of inclusion for citizens. We witness this in the discrete and often oppositional protected characteristics as a list in the Equality Act. So if the state is viewed as exhausting or useless, how best to engage with it? Here, queer can be understood as doing anti-category work, as surpassing policy confinement, and even as queer failure. Materially, these may be connected as lived-in intersections, where Alicia's experience is still too common, and regardless of Stonewall or the Time for Inclusive Education campaign, put up posters in the LGBT charter mark school as a way of increasing visibility. So they can put up a poster of a queer person of colour without that impact on a queer person of colour's educational experiences. So in 2021, I took up a parliamentary fellowship on the intersectional impact of COVID-19 on LGBTQ+ people, asking what's queer life been like in the pandemic. So I did so in response to the crisis and as part of my normal academic public engagement, and with the hope of making a difference to policy. But ongoing engagements rarely translate into policy change or state reform. And thinking with Sarah Ahmed, I might become the embodied tick box that is ticked off in entering mainstream space, while also being subject to policy or to public risk, which I think it's fair to say, having been trolled as a result of reporting back through the Scottish Parliamentary Fellowship and coming off Twitter for a while as a result, I think it's fair to say that I have experienced that kind of public hope and risk. So this rewritten tweet is anonymised from a posting which followed from the publication of my blog post, which was like, I don't know, 700 words or so. So I put out a tweet saying what has been the impact of the COVID pandemic on LGBT+ people and communities in Scotland, see blog. And then someone else had replied saying, can I have, because it was timed as it would be a 4-minute read, can I have those 4 minutes back, please? And just how much money did her new SNP, Scottish National Party, Scottish Government supply? Maybe you can undertake research into why the nasty virus doesn't recognise how special you think LGBT people are, the nerve of it infecting them. So, I'm fully aware that my limited 700-word blog is insufficient, and I'm also aware of the failure of that. And, to take it back to, report writing generally, I think, then the submitted report stated as a caption that the briefing hoped to look at LGBT plus life in the pandemic, drawn on qualitative research. And this document went back and forward with the Scottish Government, because I think it did originally have the Q and the I and the plus. And I was asked to condense that so that it resonated with the Scottish Government's specific policies around LGBT plus. Anyway, so I made a footnote which was about kind of stretching and querying these terms and pointing to perhaps the dissonance between policy and academia, as I think the tweet also exemplifies. So I wanted to think through these responses and how being a queer feminist in public it can be a risk, and it's a risk that loops around these backwards, forwards, like long-standing debates around policy elisions and public outness. So by way of a conclusion, I'll summarise sort of where I think we're up to now. So I think state transformation has different consequences for different queers, as witnessed in the replacement of nation states via the Brexit process, and a process which continues. And we see in these positionings of big world-leading global leaders, or in the language of being provincial or being small, being from elsewhere. And LGBT inclusive education has entered that space. And it's entered that space in an awkward way. It's often the third sector volunteer organisations that are tasked up with doing the work, which then the Scottish Government sort of claims as theirs. So it's not resourced. It slips as other urgencies surpass that agenda. So LGBT plus inclusive education just went out the window in the context of COVID and school lockdowns. Another paper, perhaps. But many queer accounts, and by which I mean the lived experience of being queer, echo David Eng and Jasper Poir's assessment of exhausting and exhausted state processes. Lived experiences in provincial, local, everyday spaces often collude and collide with the rhetorics of reimagined, even rainbow states, which instrumentalise LGBTQ rights for the consolidation of nationalism. Queer left agendas need to be considered with the hopeful and pragmatic possibilities and queer reconstructions within and across the borders of the nation state. So in looking backwards and forwards, and through different versions of Europeanness, Scottishness, Englishness, and Britishness, attending to the histories and presences of pushing out in and through classrooms as teachers and researchers, as students and pupils, allows us to attend to possible futures as a positive push back. So Jose Esteban Munoz, and excuse the pronunciation, talks about this in Queers in Utopia, how to play with the here, the then and there. To think, it means to think through the here and the now in terms of asking, what do we have to do differently, and how do we get there? How do we get to that future that we want? So as a queer feminist researcher, I think through the research I've done and with many others, over the 20-year period across Section 28 to the LGBT Action Plan, to the promise of an LGBT inclusive curriculum. I offer quotes to compare and contrast against exceptionality, foregrounded in other timelines. So this idea of Scotland taking itself and other nations forward, or these celebrity LGBT historical figures, you know, and I'm aware that that's a precarious position too. They're often recovered and celebrated in the past and in the present, having not experienced that celebration in their own lifetimes and their own lifelines. But I think the neat presentation of this in a linear sort of rainbow timeline is rather awkward. And so how does this compare with these two quotes across the 20-year time, which I think highlight the sort of disciplines of particular experiences, as well, in the way that classrooms across compulsory and post-compulsory contexts can shut down experiences and can be places of erasure, as well as places of contestation and fun, because I think both Cathy and the gender studies students are kind of laughing back at these errors that they've nonetheless pragmatically lived through and even surpassed and succeeded. So there are recirculations over a 20-year period, and our ideas and practices, like our embodied academic selves or non-academic selves, have timelines too. So in thinking about what hope there is for the left, as somebody writing around class, I turn to queer left thinking and to the notions of sociality and collectivity mobilised. Might sharing in and through universities bear form of what Munoz refers to as educated hope. Hope, he says, is a risk, but might in that risk we find and foster research and teaching in these policy disengagements. So might these be moments of learning and of hope? Might these openings act as a form of what Elizabeth Freeman calls chronic thinking, or observations produced in and of a situation that is persistent rather than resolvable? So it's a continuous disruptive queer practice rather than a celebrated, arrived at, included state. So the feminist queer classrooms that I've moved through have highlighted inclusive practices, readings, feelings, efforts, and how these are continuously done, enlivened, and activated. Such classroom contexts don't just exist within schools or universities, and exist in other learning places, for example, in LGBT community organisations and public libraries. So this was a list produced in such a classroom. And I'm just suggesting that these words are unlikely to appear in an LGBT inclusive classroom or an LGBT poster, and that they surpass those confines of what is usually imagined. You've got the GRA, Gender Recognition Act, you've got Me Too, you've got welfare, council states, privilege, minimum wage, family credit, mutual aid. And I think these terms themselves point to the failures of the state rather than seeing the state as a saviour of LGBT subjects. So I want to end by turning to a chapter in the new edited collection, Queer Sharing in the Marketised University. In their chapter, In Search of the Cracks in the System, Feminist and Queer Scholarship in Education in the Marketised Universities in Spain, the authors, Alejandro, Ingrid and Mauro, note that the marketised university is designed to legitimise and normalise certain epistemologies, perspectives and fields, while silencing and sidelining emergent critical or innovative approaches that may challenge its neoliberal logics. I think there's resonance between the post-compulsory classroom context and the compulsory classroom context. So aware of these these dynamics in and across different classrooms. I argue for a critical stretch beyond models, so whether that's images, charter marks, tick boxes, guidelines, which in themselves announce and conclude inclusion. How might we stretch it? I want to think of the interest and innovation of some of my current students and often undergraduate students who are in and undergoing initial teacher training. They show interest in the Scottish Government's promise of LGBT inclusive curriculum. Every year I get a number of dissertation students who want to enthusiastically write about such policy making, and I welcome that to an extent. I don't cynically write off these interests as ill-judged or hopeless, and I want to hold on to that hope in through of education, in the hope that it might lead to a riskier, queerer education, if not a queer curriculum, and is potentially then a world-leading practice rather than a world-leading identity located in national jurisdictions or in Scottish classrooms. Thank you so much for your time listening to me. I appreciate that. I look forward to questions, comments, and I wish you a good conference.
Hello, Yvette. Now you're live here with us.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. Moltíssimes gràcies, Yvette, per la teva ponència. Tenim molt poquet temps, tenim uns 10 minuts. Obrirem les preguntes per si algú en vol fer alguna de l'audiència. Tenim el micròfon.
Hola. Hi, Yvette. I have two questions. One is very short, but I caught the term chronic thinking, but I didn't catch the author that you mentioned. So I would love if you could talk about that. And also, you started by being very critical of optimism at the beginning and talking about skepticism. But then towards the end, you mentioned hope as a risk, but also as a productive force. So I was thinking about optimism, and I would like to know your thoughts on optimism as a teaching tool or as a productive force in education.
Okay, Ingrid, would you like me to go ahead?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much for the question. I think these are connected, that chronic thinking and that optimism, because when I talk about optimism, it's not a case of, say, just being happy or just anticipating that by investing in, say, LGBT inclusive curriculum or the university or the classroom, that change will inevitably come about in and of itself. So that optimism isn't naive. It has to be resourced and supported and sustained. And I think there's a link between that chronic thinking. How do we go back through our own labours, through our own struggles, through our own writing and reading, and still maybe perhaps do the very same work over and over again? And by that, I mean my own labour, of course, but I also mean the wider labour done in through classrooms and contexts such as these. So that optimism isn't naive, it isn't it's not romanticising, and I think it can be easily mobilised by, say, the right wing as well. It can be individualised. It can be, well, you made it in education. You are a success story. So that is evidence that the system works and that we should be optimistic about education. So my scepticism is intended to point out to those failures and whether those failures can be interruptive and constructive. So how do we return to the table nonetheless? How do we re-enter the classroom? How do we engage with our students who nonetheless want to be really enthusiastic about living in Scotland, life in Scotland today? Do we just cast that as naive, or does that help us re-enter those spaces differently? I'm not sure what the exact, chronic thinking is Elizabeth Freeman's term. I'm not sure if I invoked what other terms that I invoked, so you might have to remind me. But I think with Munoz, I think that there is a risk around that optimism as well, and some of the policy engagement was alluding to those riskier those riskier spaces too. So the risk in being in public, the risk and over again feeling perhaps your own educational loss or failure.
Thank you very much, Yvette. Hi ha alguna altra pregunta? I was very, very impressed when you were kind of criticizing how, well, putting on the table the term homonationalism, when this fight for LGBTQ plus right can become supportive of other narratives that are equally sexist and so on. Because here, like, we are really like fighting, like, really in a blind way to include those transformations in the state. And as you say, those transformations can have different consequences for different queers. But so far, how would you define, or if you have noticed any good since you have this education, this LGBTI plus inclusive education in Scotland? So how queer children or queer adolescents or queer youth is receiving those state transformations regarding education?
Yeah. So what is the positive worth in these policies nonetheless? Despite that critique, is there evidence that real change is enacted? Likely, I think there is a lot of affirmation, but I think that does individualize that. So I think it treats LGBT plus as discrete identities rather than as also lived in through race, class, gender. So, as I think I mentioned, in Scotland, in the Scottish context, in the UK context, class is the major decider of educational experience. So what does it mean to put class inequalities and sexual and gender inequalities on the same page, rather than extract it and think about and expecting a poster, for example, as affirmation to do all of the work? So I want to say, yeah, it does some of the work. This is certainly better than the Section 28 context of the 1980s, 90s and early 2000s. Some teachers are now talking about LGBT plus inclusion in the classroom, but remember, this is a guideline, and within that guideline, teachers, and particularly head teachers, have a lot of scope to opt out, to do things differently. So it just compels a mentioning that can be anything. It doesn't, it's standardizing, it doesn't necessitate a deeper discussion that maybe queer feminists would anticipate around, say, issues of consent, or around what's even success or relationships or emotions or feelings might seem like. So I think it's kind of been instrumentalized too, and it's been hugely under-resourced. So it has a place at the table, but I think that can be easily upturned in different policy moments and in different public moments where, for example, COVID featured as such a highlight necessarily that LGBT equality in schools fell completely off the agenda. So it can be pulled, and when we know in the context of Scotland that this announcement of itself as world leading, as progressive, is fairly new in the context of quite a conservative past, can we be certain that this is enough, and can we be certain that we're always just going to build on these small practices? What else do we want? So I kind of want to welcome some of that into the classroom, but make sure it's not a classroom containment.
Thank you very, very much, Yvette. I'm going to change your microphone because I'm going to talk in Catalan. Can you hear now the translator?
I think that yet to kick in.
No? I think now you can hear translators. Yes.
Yes.
Bé, moltíssimes gràcies, Yvette, per la teva ponència. Moltíssimes gràcies a tothom per aquest inici de congrés.